Imagine standing in the half-light of dawn facing a wall, not just any wall, the oldest wall ever built by human hands. It rises from the earth like a memory-made solid, ancient mud, brick and stone that has stood for over 11,000 years. Your fingers touch the surface and you realize something profound. For 290,000 years, anatomically modern humans wandered the earth. No cities, no permanent homes, just endless movement, following herds, chasing seasons, living light and free under open sky. Then suddenly, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, everything changed. Right here, at this wall. What happened? What force was powerful enough to make nomadic people stop wandering and start building? What compelled them to trade the freedom of the open plains for life behind walls? This is the mystery that has obsessed archaeologists for nearly a century, and the answers they've found are way stranger than anyone expected. Today, over half of humanity lives in cities. We think of urban life as normal, as inevitable, as the natural endpoint of human progress. We assume the first cities must have been primitive versions of what we have now. Simple mud huts clustered around a well, maybe a basic temple, early humans just figuring things out. Wrong. The first cities were nothing like what we imagined. No kings, no palaces, no temples towering over cowering masses. The archaeological evidence shows something far more radical, something that challenges everything we thought we knew about civilization, power and human nature. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at midnight, Toronto at twilight, all at once. There's something beautiful about all of us scattered across the planet, connected by curiosity about the very first people who chose to stop scattering. See, for most of the 20th century, archaeologists had a clean, simple story about how civilization began. First came agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Farming allowed food surpluses. Surpluses led to specialization. Specialization created social hierarchies. Hierarchies built cities. Neat, linear, logical. Then they started actually digging into the older settlements, and that clean story fell apart completely. The first permanent settlements weren't farming villages. They were built by people who were still primarily hunter-gatherers. The first large-scale communities didn't have obvious leaders or rulers. The first cities didn't have defensive walls to keep enemies out. And perhaps strangest of all, some of the earliest and most sophisticated urban centres were mysteriously abandoned at the height of their success, left empty for reasons we still don't fully understand. The discovery of these first cities rewrote human history. Not just ancient history, all of history. Because these weren't just old settlements, they were experiments. Radical social experiments in how humans could live together, and understanding what worked, what failed, and why these places were eventually abandoned tells us something crucial about ourselves, about the choices we're still making today. Tonight we're going back 11,000 years, back to a time when the last ice age had just ended and the world was warming into something new. Back to the moment when humans decided to try something that had never been done before, living together in permanent settlements of thousands of people. No genetic programming for this, no instinct. We're not ants. We didn't evolve to live in hives. This was pure invention, pure improvisation. We're going to walk the narrow streets of the oldest urban centres. We're going to enter the houses, surprisingly sophisticated houses, with their walls covered in strange art. We're going to meet the people, see what they ate, what they believed, how they buried their dead. We're going to witness their triumphs and their failures, the moments of breathtaking creativity and the evidence of shocking violence. Most importantly, We're going to try to answer the biggest question of all: why? Why did they do it? What did they gain by giving up the mobile life their ancestors had lived successfully for hundreds of thousands of years? And what did it cost them? Because here's what the archaeological evidence reveals. Becoming civilized nearly killed us. The first cities were disease-ridden, violent, and short-lived. Life expectancy actually dropped when people moved into permanent settlements. People got shorter, sicker, more stressed. Their bones tell a story of malnutrition and hard labor that nomadic hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. So why didn't they just leave? Why did they keep building, keep trying, keep experimenting with urban life even when it was clearly making them miserable? The answer is written in the walls, the oldest walls, and it's not the answer anyone expected. Let's begin at the beginning. Before the walls, before the cities, before everything changed. Before there were walls, before there were cities, before humans even conceived of living in one place for more than a season, there was movement. Endless, purposeful movement across landscapes that would seem impossibly abundant to modern eyes. Picture this. 15,000 years ago, somewhere in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, the Ice Age is finally releasing its grip on the planet. Glaciers that had covered much of Europe and Asia for 100,000 years are retreating northward, and in their wake something miraculous is happening. The Middle East is transforming into a paradise, not the desert we think of today, not the dry, harsh landscape of modern Syria, Lebanon, or southeastern Turkey. This was something else entirely. A Mediterranean climate on steroids. Rainfall that would make a modern farmer weep with joy. Temperatures perfect for plant growth nearly, year-round. And stretching across the hills and valleys from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf. Endless fields of wild wheat, barley and rye. These weren't the domesticated crops we know today. These were their wild ancestors, growing so thick in some areas you could walk for miles through chest-high grain. Anthropologists call this period the Natufian, named after a valley in Israel where the first evidence was discovered. But that name doesn't capture the sheer abundance of what was happening. This was nature's experiment in plenty, a test run for what agriculture might look like without humans having to do any of the work. And it wasn't just plants. The grassland supported herds of gazelles numbering in the tens of thousands, wild cattle, deer, onagers, wild sheep and goats, flocks of birds so vast they darkened the sky during migration seasons. Rivers and streams teemed with fish. The landscape was a protein buffet that renewed itself every year. Into this paradise came small groups of human hunter-gatherers, your ancestors, people who had spent the previous 200,000 years perfecting the art of survival through mobility. They knew how to read landscapes, how to track animals, how to identify hundreds of edible plants. They could predict where resources would appear months in advance based on subtle environmental cues. They were experts at not staying put. Typically, a hunting-gathering band numbered maybe 25 to 50 people, extended families mostly, a few adult males, their partners, children, maybe some elderly grandparents who served as repositories of knowledge. They moved constantly, following the game, tracking the seasonal ripening of plants, always staying where the resources were most abundant. They travelled light because they had to. Everything you owned, you carried. A few stone tools, some weapons, hide bags for gathering, maybe a grinding stone for processing seeds. Shelters were temporary, simple structures made from whatever materials were handy. Branches and hides in forested areas, grasses and reeds near rivers. You could set up camp in a few hours and abandon it just as quickly when it was time to move on. This was the human condition for 99% of our species' history. constant movement, intimate knowledge of the landscape, survival based on flexibility, and the ability to exploit whatever resources presented themselves. It worked. Our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were thriving, spreading across every continent except Antarctica, adapting to environments from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. But then something strange started happening in the Fertile Crescent. Some groups stopped moving, not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice. Archaeological sites from around 13,000 years ago show something unprecedented. Permanent structures, not temporary shelters meant to last a season, but substantial buildings made from stone foundations with timber frames. Buildings meant to last years, maybe decades. These weren't cities. They weren't even villages by our standards. Maybe a few dozen people living in 4 or 5 structures clustered together. But they were staying put, at least for part of the year. Archaeologists call these semi-permanent camps, but that term doesn't capture how revolutionary they were. For the first time in human history, people were investing serious labour in structures they couldn't take with them. They were betting on the landscape providing enough resources in one place to make staying worthwhile. And the bet paid off. Those wild grain fields were so productive you could harvest enough in a few weeks to feed your family for months. The gazelle herds migrated through the same valleys every year, predictable as sunrise. Rivers provided reliable water and fish. Why keep moving when everything you needed was right here? So they stayed, and staying changed them in ways nobody could have predicted. When you're mobile, possessions are a burden. Every pot, every tool, every decorative item is something you have to carry. But when you're staying put, suddenly accumulation makes sense. Archaeological sites from this period start showing elaborate grinding stones, storage pits, decorative objects made from shells and stones, things that would have been impossibly impractical for mobile hunter-gatherers. More importantly, staying put changed their relationship with the land itself. Mobile hunter-gatherers see territory as something you pass through, a resource to be exploited and then left behind. But when you stay in one place, that hillside isn't just a temporary camp, it's home. The spirits of your ancestors are buried there. Your children were born there. Every tree and rock and stream becomes imbued with meaning and memory. The spiritual world of these early semi-sedentary peoples was rich and strange. We know this from their art and their burials. They carved images of animals on stone pillars. Not just any animals, but specific species rendered with incredible anatomical accuracy. Gazelles, cattle, snakes, birds, foxes. Sometimes human figures too, though these were more stylized, more abstract. But it was the burials that tell the real story. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses. Right there, under where the living walked and slept and ate. Sometimes they would dig up the skulls months or years later, cover them with plaster, paint them to look alive, give them shell eyes. Then they'd keep these plastered skulls in the house, creating what must have been an incredibly powerful connection between the living and the dead. This wasn't ancestor worship in the way we usually think of it. This was something more immediate, more visceral. Your grandfather's skull is literally staring at you from across the room. Your great-grandmother's bones are beneath your feet. The ancestors weren't distant figures from myth. They were present, watching, part of the daily fabric of life. And the animals weren't just food anymore. They were spiritual beings, partners in a cosmic drama that humans were only beginning to understand. Some sites show elaborate feasting remains, hundreds of gazelle bones from communal hunts, suggesting ritual meals that brought scattered groups together. These weren't just practical activities. They were ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and spiritual connections between humans, animals, and the land itself. For over 2,000 years, this system worked beautifully. The Natufian people lived well, multiplied, spread across the Fertile Crescent in dozens of semi-permanent settlements. They weren't farmers yet, but they were experimenting with managing wild plants, maybe doing some light weeding, protecting productive stands of grain from animals. They were on the cusp of something transformative. Then the sky fell. Well, not literally, but close enough. Around 12,800 years ago, something catastrophic happened to Earth's climate. We call it the Younger Dryas, named after a flowering plant that suddenly became common across Europe. But that name is far too gentle for what actually occurred. In less than a decade, possibly in just a few years, average temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. The warm, wet climate that had turned the Fertile Crescent into paradise vanished like someone flipping a switch. The cause is still debated. Some scientists think fresh water from melting glaciers disrupted ocean currents that carry heat northward. Others suggest a comet impact or volcanic eruption. What matters is the effect. Those endless fields of wild grain withered and retreated to tiny refuges. The gazelle herds crashed as grasslands turned to scrub. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal. The buffet was closed. For people who had become accustomed to abundance, who had built permanent homes and developed elaborate spiritual connections to specific landscapes, this was catastrophic. Archaeological evidence shows many Natufian settlements were abandoned. Some groups went back to full mobile hunting and gathering, returning to the ancient strategy of avoiding disaster through movement. The population probably crashed. But some groups refused to leave, or maybe they couldn't. By this point, they'd been living in permanent settlements for hundreds of years, dozens of generations. The semi-mobile lifestyle of their ancestors was knowledge that had been lost. Plus, they had developed technologies and stored knowledge about plant and animal management that might offer a way through the crisis. If you couldn't find enough wild grain, maybe you could plant it yourself. If wild herds were disappearing, maybe you could keep your own animals. This is the critical moment, the fork in the road where humanity could have gone back to the old ways, or pushed forward into something unprecedented. Some populations chose tradition. They survived by returning to mobile hunting and gathering, and their descendants are still living that way in some parts of the world. But other populations chose innovation. They began what we now call the Neolithic Revolution. Though revolution is probably the wrong word. It was more like a desperate experiment that happened to work. They started deliberately planting wild grains and saving the seeds from the most productive plants. They began capturing young gazelles and sheep, keeping them in pens, breeding them in captivity. They invented agriculture and animal husbandry not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was starvation. And it worked. Barely, at first. Those first cultivated plants were nutritionally inferior to their wild cousins. The first domestic animals were scrawny and difficult compared to wild game, but they were reliable. You couldn't control whether wild herds would pass through your valley, but you could control when you planted seeds and harvested grain. You couldn't predict whether good hunting weather would cooperate, but you could count on your captive animals being there when you needed them. Over centuries, this experiment transformed both the plants and animals and the humans who depended on them. Wheat and barley evolved larger seeds and non-shattering heads that made harvesting easier. Sheep and goats became docile and dependent. Humans developed the ability to digest milk into adulthood and process the high-starch diets that came with grain consumption. Coevolution in real time, driven by climate catastrophe. But this innovation came with a cost. Agriculture is brutally hard work. Studies of skeletal remains show that early farmers were less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Shorter, more dental problems, more signs of nutritional stress and repetitive strain injuries. Their diets were less diverse and more vulnerable to crop failures. A mobile hunter-gatherer who encounters poor resources in one area can just move somewhere else. A farmer whose crops fail faces starvation. Yet they persisted. They had to. The Younger Dryas lasted for over 1,000 years. By the time the climate finally stabilized around 11,600 years ago, and warmth returned to the Middle East, the transformation was complete. Agriculture was established. Domestic animals were thriving. And humans had figured out how to produce their own food rather than just harvesting what nature provided. The question now was what to do with this new power. Small farming villages were spreading across the Fertile Crescent. Populations were growing beyond anything seen during the hunting-gathering era. But these were still small communities, maybe 100 to 200 people at most, still organized along kinship lines, still small enough that everyone knew everyone else. Then one group, on one hilltop in southern Anatolia, decided to try something that would have been unthinkable just a few generations earlier. They decided to build not a village but a city, a place where thousands of people would live together surrounded by walls, creating the first true urban experiment in human history. They called their creation Çatalhöyük, and nothing would ever be the same. Let's talk about what happened roughly 9,000 years ago in what is now south-central Turkey. Because what emerged there shouldn't have been possible. Not yet. Not according to everything we thought we knew about how human societies develop. The place is called Çatalhöyük, and for decades after its discovery, archaeologists couldn't agree on what to call it. Was it a village? A town? Something else entirely? Because nothing in the archaeological playbook prepared anyone for what they found buried beneath those Turkish wheat fields. Here's the problem. When you're trying to define what makes a city, you run into trouble fast. Population size. That's arbitrary. Rome started as a cluster of huts. Athens was smaller than many modern suburbs for centuries. Social complexity. Hard to measure from ruins. Monumental architecture. Plenty of villages built impressive structures. But there are a few features that most archaeologists agree mark the transition from village to urban centre. Dense population living in permanent structures, specialised labour beyond just hunters and farmers, some form of social organisation capable of coordinating thousands of people, evidence of planning, of collective decision-making that goes beyond family units. Çatalhöyük had all of this, and it had something else, something that still makes archaeologists uncomfortable when they talk about it. It had roughly 10,000 people living packed together in a settlement that covered 13 hectares, that's about 32 acres, all at once. Not gradually over centuries, not as a slow accumulation of population, but apparently all at once, sometime around 7,100 BCE, thousands of people decided to build humanity's first urban experiment. Now, you might have heard of Jericho. It's older, dating back to around 9,000 BCE, maybe earlier. Some archaeologists call it the world's first city. But here's the thing about Jericho. At its peak, it probably housed maybe 1,000 people, possibly 2,000 at most. It had impressive fortifications, yes, that famous wall, those stone towers, but it was small, more like a fortified town than a true urban centre. Çatalhöyük was different. Çatalhöyük was massive, and it was weird. Really, genuinely, fundamentally weird in ways that challenge everything we think we know about how cities should work. First, there were no streets. None. Zero. Not even narrow alleyways. The houses at Çatalhöyük were built directly against each other, sharing walls, packed together like cells in a honeycomb. If you wanted to go somewhere, you didn't walk down the street. You climbed onto your roof, walked across your neighbour's roof, then across the next neighbour's roof until you reached your destination. The entire city was a continuous rooftop pathway. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a place where the concept of a street doesn't exist, where public and private space are completely reimagined, where your roof is everyone's sidewalk and everyone's roof is your sidewalk, Second, there were no doors, at least not at ground level. Each house was entered through a hole in the roof, accessed by ladder. You climbed up, crossed the rooftops to your house, then descended down through a hatch into your living space. Every single dwelling worked this way, hundreds of them packed together, all accessed from above. Now, when British archaeologist James Mellart first excavated Çatalhöyük in 1958, he thought he was looking at a village, maybe a large village, but still just a farming settlement. The site had been known to archaeologists for decades, just another tell, another ancient mound in a region full of them. Nobody expected what lay beneath. The first season of excavation revealed a few houses, interesting, well preserved, but not revolutionary. The second season revealed more houses, and more, and more. As Mellart's team expanded their excavation area, they kept finding the same thing. Densely packed rectangular structures, all built in the same strange style, all accessed through roof hatches, all sharing walls with their neighbours. By the third season, Mellart realised he wasn't excavating a village at all. He was excavating something unprecedented, a settlement so large, so densely populated, so clearly organised according to some grand plan that it defied every assumption about how early farming communities should look. The scale becomes clear when you understand the layout. Each house was roughly rectangular, about 25 square metres on average. That's roughly 270 square feet, roughly the size of a modern studio apartment. Inside, the layout was remarkably standardised. A main room with built-in platforms along the walls that served as both seating and sleeping areas, a hearth for cooking and warmth, an oven for baking, storage bins set into the floor, and beneath it all, burial chambers where residents entomb their dead. But here's what makes Çatalhöyük truly urban rather than just a big village. The houses weren't scattered randomly or clustered in family compounds. They were organised in a precise grid pattern. Not a perfect grid. This wasn't ancient Rome with its rigid city planning, but clear evidence of systematic organisation. Neighbourhoods of similar-sized houses, all oriented roughly the same way, all built to the same general specifications. Somebody planned this. Or more likely, many somebodies, working together, following shared rules about how houses should be built and where they should go. This is collective decision-making on a scale that shouldn't exist in a society without writing, without bureaucracy, without any of the administrative apparatus we associate with urban planning. And they didn't just build one layer of city. Çatalhöyük was continuously inhabited for nearly 1,400 years. Over that time, as old houses crumbled or were demolished, new ones were built directly on top, following the same layout, maintaining the same streetless rooftop pathway design. The site formed a tell, an artificial mound made up of layer upon layer of collapsed and rebuilt houses, eventually rising to a height of over 20 metres, that's about 65 feet, above the surrounding plain. Archaeologists have identified at least 18 distinct building levels. Each represents a generation or two of occupation. Each shows roughly the same layout, the same population density, the same basic urban design. For nearly 1,400 years, the people of Çatalhöyük maintained this bizarre experiment in urban living, passing down through dozens of generations the knowledge of how to build and maintain a city without streets. The population estimates are staggering when you think about what they mean. At any given time, between 5,000 and 10,000 people were living in this settlement. Compare that to Jericho's 1,000 to 2,000. Compare it to most early farming villages, which typically housed fewer than 200 people. Çatalhöyük wasn't just bigger, it was an order of magnitude bigger. But size alone doesn't make a city. What makes Çatalhöyük urban is the evidence of specialization and complexity. Not everyone was farming. The residents of Çatalhöyük were producing obsidian tools in such quantities that they must have been trading them across vast distances. They were making elaborate pottery, weaving textiles, creating art, conducting rituals. These activities required specialists, people who spent their time doing things other than growing food, which means the society had to be organized in a way that allowed some people to not farm while ensuring everyone still ate. That requires economic complexity, social structures that can redistribute resources, mechanisms for deciding who does what and who gets what. The excavations have revealed no palaces, no temples clearly separate from residential areas, no obvious administrative buildings. But they have revealed something else. The houses, while roughly similar in size, show subtle but significant differences. Some have more elaborate decorations, some have more storage space, some contain more valuable goods. This suggests social differentiation, a hierarchy, though apparently a fairly subtle one. Most intriguingly, the city seems to have been largely egalitarian in its basic layout. Unlike later cities with their grand central temples and elite residential quarters, Çatalhöyük appears to have mixed everything together. Rich and poor, if those terms even applied yet, lived side by side in nearly identical houses, all accessed the same way, all built to the same general plan. This challenges another assumption about urban development. We tend to think cities arise because of hierarchy, because powerful individuals or institutions can organize and control large populations. But Çatalhöyük suggests something different. Maybe cities can emerge from cooperation, from groups of people deciding together to live in a new way, maintaining rough equality even as population density explodes. Or maybe we're just not seeing the evidence of hierarchy clearly. Maybe the power structures at Çatalhöyük were expressed in ways that don't survive in the archaeological record. Social status based on knowledge rather than wealth. Political power exercised through ritual authority rather than force. These are possibilities, but we simply don't know yet. What we do know is that Çatalhöyük represents humanity's first successful experiment in urban density. 10,000 people living literally on top of each other, sharing walls, walking across each other's roofs, breathing each other's smoke, hearing each other's arguments and celebrations, all somehow managing to coexist for over a millennium. When you compare Çatalhöyük to its contemporaries, the achievement becomes even more remarkable. Across the Middle East, the Neolithic revolution was in full swing. People were domesticating plants and animals, settling down, building permanent villages. But most of these settlements housed a few dozen people, maybe 100 or 2 at most. They were extended family groups, kinship networks, small enough that everyone knew everyone. Çatalhöyük shattered that scale. It forced humans to figure out how to live with strangers, how to maintain order without the bonds of kinship, how to make collective decisions involving hundreds of households. It was a laboratory for urban social organization, and somehow, against all odds, it worked. For 1,400 years it worked. That's longer than Rome dominated the Mediterranean, longer than the United States has existed, longer than most civilizations maintain any kind of stability. The people of Çatalhöyük solved problems that would plague cities for millennia to come. Sanitation, resource distribution, conflict resolution, maintenance of public spaces, even if those public spaces were everyone's rooftops. And then we lost it. For 8,000 years, Çatalhöyük was forgotten. The site was abandoned sometime around 5,600 BCE, for reasons we still don't fully understand. The ruins gradually eroded and were buried under millennia of dust and vegetation. The wheat fields grew over it. Farmers ploughed the earth above it, never knowing they were walking over the remains of humanity's first urban experiment. When Mellart finally excavated it in 1958, he was uncovering not just an ancient settlement, but proof that our ancestors were capable of social complexity far earlier than anyone had imagined, that they could organize, cooperate, and innovate on massive scales without writing, without bureaucracy, without any of the tools we think are necessary for urban life. Çatalhöyük changed everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization, but it also raised more questions than it answered. How did 10,000 people actually live in this maze of rooftop pathways? What did daily life look like? And perhaps most importantly, what were they thinking? What beliefs, what worldview could convince thousands of people to abandon the open villages of their ancestors and pile together into humanity's first city? To answer those questions, we need to climb down through one of those roof hatches and step inside. You wake up in darkness. Not complete darkness, because there's never complete darkness in Çatalhöyük. The hearth in the corner still glows faintly from last night's fire, casting dim orange light across the white plaster walls. Above you, footsteps, always footsteps, because in the world's first city nobody walks on streets. They walk on roofs. Your roof, everyone's roof. The sleeping platform beneath you is hard, packed earth covered with reed mats and animal skins. Next to you, your family still sleeps. 3 generations in a room barely 12 feet square. This isn't poverty. This is normal. Everyone in Çatalhöyük lives like this, packed together in mud brick houses that share walls with their neighbours, creating a honeycomb of humanity stretching across 34 acres. You climb carefully off the platform, trying not to wake anyone. The floor is cold under your feet, tamped earth mixed with clay, polished smooth from years of use. But you're careful where you step, because beneath this floor, beneath the very ground you're walking on, your ancestors are buried. Your grandmother is somewhere under the northwestern corner. Your infant brother, who died 3 years ago, rests beneath the sleeping platform. Maybe 8 or 9 bodies total, interred over the decades this house has stood. This isn't creepy to you. This is comfort. Your family isn't just living in this house. They're part of it. Their bones literally support the structure. When you die, you'll join them, wrapped in a reed mat and buried in a fetal position in the same earth where you spent your life sleeping, eating, and raising children. The ladder is in the centre of the room, leading up through the only opening in the house. No doors, no windows, just this hole in the roof serving as entrance, exit, chimney, and only source of light. You climb up, pushing through into the morning air, and suddenly you're in a different world. The rooftops of Çatalhöyük stretch in every direction, a vast expanse of flat mud brick surfaces broken up by countless ladder holes and the occasional courtyard where smoke rises from communal ovens. People are already moving, walking from roof to roof, balancing baskets on their heads, carrying water jars from the river, leading goats across the tops of houses. This is the real city. Not down in those dark rooms below, but up here where everyone can see and be seen, where gossip travels faster than fire, where a woman carrying a basket of obsidian cores can be spotted from 100 yards away, and everyone knows she's been trading with the merchants from the volcano territories. The sun is just coming up over the Konya plain, turning the sky pink and orange. In the distance, you can see the twin volcanoes of Hasan Dağ, 60 miles away but visible on clear mornings. That's where the obsidian comes from, the black volcanic glass that's made Çatalhöyük wealthy. Without those volcanoes, this city probably wouldn't exist. But we'll get to that. First, you need to eat. You make your way across the roofs, following paths worn smooth by thousands of feet. Some roofs have low walls around the ladder holes to keep children from falling in. Others are completely open, and you have to be careful not to step into someone's house by accident. The etiquette is simple, though. If you can see the ladder, you can walk near it. If you can't, you're trespassing. The communal oven is in a courtyard 3 houses over. Several families use it, taking turns baking bread, roasting meat, and preparing the einkorn wheat that's become the staple of life here. Inkhorn is a recent innovation, relatively speaking. Your great-grandparents ate mostly wild grains and game. Now people are deliberately planting wheat, tending it, harvesting it. Nobody calls it agriculture yet. Nobody calls it anything. It's just what you do to survive. A woman is already at the oven, shaping flat discs of dough mixed with water and wild lentils. The smell is incredible, yeasty and warm. You exchange greetings, news about whose child is sick, whose husband brought back a deer yesterday. This is how information flows in Çatalhöyük, through these casual morning conversations that connect every household to every other household within a few degrees of separation. The bread is ready quickly, baked on hot stones inside the clay oven. You take your portion and head back to your house, but you don't go inside yet. Instead, you sit on the roof, legs dangling over the edge, eating warm bread and watching the city wake up. And it is waking up. By now, hundreds of people are moving across the rooftops. You can identify occupations by what they're carrying. The obsidian workers head to the southern edge of the settlement where the workshops are. The textile weavers gather in certain courtyards where the light is best. The potters make their way to the clay pits just outside the city, carefully navigating down the outer ladders that connect the roof level to the ground. Because that's the thing about Çatalhöyük. The ground level barely exists. Oh, there are narrow alleys between some houses where rainwater drains and refuse piles up. There are workshops built into the gaps between buildings, but there are no streets, no plazas, no public squares. Everything important happens on the roofs or inside the houses. The city isn't built horizontally like modern cities. It's built vertically, a dense cluster of rooms stacked together with life happening above them. You finish eating and head inside to start your work. Your family makes obsidian tools. Not the finest work, not the mirrors and ceremonial blades that take months to produce, but basic tools, cutting flakes, scrapers, knives that people use every day. It's skilled work, requiring knowledge passed down through generations, but it's not specialized enough that you only do this. Nobody in Çatalhöyük only does one thing. The obsidian cores are stored in the southwestern corner of the main room, wrapped in leather to protect them. You take one out, feeling its weight, examining it for flaws. Obsidian is tricky material. Hit it wrong, and the whole piece shatters. Hit it right, and you can produce edges sharper than modern surgical steel. You work through the morning, using an antler hammer to carefully strike flakes off the core. Each piece requires judgment, angle, and force calculated by feel and experience. The sound echoes in the small room, a sharp crack each time stone meets stone. Your children watch, learning. Your mother offers advice, correcting your angle when you're about to make a mistake she can see coming from decades of experience. By midday, you have a dozen usable blades. Not bad. These will trade for food, for textiles, maybe for one of those ceramic pots that a family across the settlement makes. Because that's how Çatalhöyük works. No markets, no money, just networks of exchange connecting households that produce different goods. You make obsidian tools, they make pots, someone else weaves baskets, another family tends the cattle that are starting to be domesticated in pens outside the city. The cattle are new, like the inkhorn wheat. Your grandparents hunted wild aurochs, massive dangerous animals that could kill a hunter as easily as a hunter could kill them. But somehow, people figured out that if you capture the calves and raise them from birth, they become manageable. Not tame exactly, not yet, but manageable. It'll be generations before anyone breeds them into truly domestic animals, but the process has started. For now, most meat still comes from hunting, wild boar, deer, and the occasional aurochs for those brave or foolish enough to try. The hunters leave at dawn, heading out onto the Konya plain where herds still roam. They'll return at dusk with whatever they've caught, and the meat will be distributed through those same networks of kinship and obligation that govern everything else in the city. Lunch is more bread, this time with lentils and wild onions. You eat on the roof again because the house is stifling in the midday heat. The summer sun beats down on Çatalhöyük without mercy, turning the mud brick houses into ovens. People retreat to the cooler lower rooms or sit in the shade of the few courtyards that have awnings. The afternoon brings different work. Your wife is weaving, using a simple loom propped against the wall of the main room. The thread is made from wild flax, processed into fibres, spun, and now being woven into cloth. It's tedious work, requiring hours of careful attention. But the result is remarkable. Fabric fine enough to trade for valuable goods, beautiful enough to be buried with the dead. And there will be a burial soon. An old man 3 houses over died yesterday, and tonight his family will inter him beneath their floor. You'll attend because everyone attends burials. They're not sombre occasions, not really. Death is too common for that. Children die regularly. Women die in childbirth. Men die from injuries and infections. By the time someone reaches old age, it's almost a celebration. The burial preparation happens inside the family's house, so you don't see most of it. But you know what's happening. The body's being tightly flexed, knees drawn up to chest, arms wrapped around legs. Then it's wrapped in a reed mat, tied with plant fibre cord. Meanwhile, someone is digging a pit beneath the floor, usually beneath one of the sleeping platforms. It's exhausting work in the confined space, but it has to be done. By evening, everything is ready. You climb down into the house with a dozen other neighbours. The room is packed, barely enough space to move. The wrapped body lies next to the open pit. The family says words, though not prayers exactly. Nobody in Çatalhöyük seems to have priests or formal religion as we'd understand it. But they have rituals, and this is one of them. The body is lowered into the pit. No grave goods with this one, though some burials include obsidian blades, jewellery made from bone and stone, occasionally a prized basket or textile. But this man was neither wealthy nor poor. Those concepts don't really exist yet. Everyone in Çatalhöyük lives in roughly the same size house. Everyone eats roughly the same food. The obsidian worker and the pot maker and the textile weaver all live side by side in identical rooms. There are differences, subtle ones. Some houses have more elaborate wall paintings. Some families seem to have larger networks of trade relationships. But there's nothing like the inequality that will characterize later civilizations. No palaces, no temples, no elite quarters, just hundreds of identical houses packed together, each one home to an extended family living and dying and burying their dead beneath the floor. The pit is filled in, tamped down, smoothed over. In a few weeks you won't be able to tell where the burial was. The floor will be replastered. Life will continue. The man will become part of the house, his bones mixing with his ancestors' bones, all of them supporting the structure where his children and grandchildren will live. You climb back up to the roof as night falls. The city is settling down, smoke rising from hundreds of hearths as families prepare evening meals. The smell of cooking meat and baking bread drifts across the rooftops. Children are called inside, goats are secured. The last of the workers return from the fields and workshops. You sit for a moment before descending into your own house, looking out across this impossible place. 10,000 people living together without streets, without rulers, without any of the structures that we think cities require. Just families in rooms connected by roofs and kinship, and the shared project of survival. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again. And the day after that, and the day after that. For 1,000 years people will live this way in Çatalhöyük, generation after generation climbing ladders and walking roofs and burying their dead beneath their floors. They don't know they're making history. They don't know this is humanity's first experiment with urban life. They're just living, eating, working, dying. But they're also creating something that's never existed before. A new way of being human. A way that will echo through every city that comes after, every civilization that rises and falls. And it all starts here, in these dark rooms beneath the rooftops, in the world's oldest walls. Now we need to talk about what these people believed. Because here's the thing, when archaeologists first excavated Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, they expected to find temples, separate buildings dedicated to worship like every other ancient civilization. Instead, they found something much stranger. Every house was a temple. Walk into any dwelling in Çatalhöyük and you're immediately confronted by something that shouldn't be there. A massive pair of bull horns mounted directly into the wall plaster. Not carved, not painted. Actual horns from actual bulls embedded into the living space like some kind of prehistoric interior design statement. Except it wasn't decoration. These horns were positioned in places of honor, usually on the main wall facing the entrance. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 sets in a single room, creating a kind of horn gallery that dominated the space. The skulls of the bulls themselves were often there too, plastered into benches or built into the walls at floor level. You'd literally be sitting on top of cattle remains, sleeping near them, eating your meals surrounded by them. This wasn't just respect for animals, this was something else. Something about control, about dominance, about transforming wild power into domestic order. But the bulls were just the beginning. Look up at the walls and you'd see paintings, not simple decorations or random patterns, but sophisticated multi-layered artworks that showed something profound about how these first city dwellers saw their world. The most common motif was geometric patterns, diamond shapes, zigzags, parallel lines that flowed across the plaster in intricate designs. At first glance they look almost modern, like abstract art from the 20th century. But look closer and patterns emerge. Some archaeologists think these geometric designs are actually maps, topographical representations of the landscape around the city. Mountains rendered as triangular patterns, rivers as flowing lines, fields as rectangular grids. If they're right, this means the people of Çatalhöyük were doing something revolutionary. They were abstracting their environment, reducing 3-dimensional space to 2-dimensional symbols. They were thinking cartographically thousands of years before anyone supposedly invented maps. They were taking the chaotic natural world and organizing it into comprehensible patterns on their walls. But not all the paintings were abstract. Some were brutally, vividly realistic. Leopards, painted life-sized, stalking across walls in hunting poses. The artist captured every muscle, every spot, every detail of these apex predators, and they weren't painted in safe, distant corners. They were positioned at eye level, sometimes appearing to leap directly at whoever entered the room. Think about what that means psychologically. You're living in humanity's first real city. You've left behind the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where you existed as part of nature's food chain. You've built walls, domesticated animals, created civilization. And yet you're painting the things that used to hunt your ancestors directly onto your living room walls. You're bringing the wild into the domestic space, refusing to forget what you came from. Even more unsettling are the vulture paintings. Huge birds with massive wingspans, sometimes shown attacking or carrying away what appear to be human bodies. Headless corpses surrounded by vultures became a recurring theme in multiple buildings. Archaeologists debated for decades what this meant. Were these scenes of death and decomposition evidence of sky burial practices where bodies were left for birds to consume? Or something more symbolic, representations of the soul's journey after death? The answer probably involves all three, because the people of Çatalhöyük had a very particular relationship with death, one that modern people would find deeply strange. They kept their ancestors in the house. When someone died in Çatalhöyük, they weren't taken away to some distant cemetery. They were buried right under the floor of the family home, multiple generations stacked on top of each other in shallow graves beneath the very platforms where people slept and ate. You were literally living on top of your dead relatives. But it gets weirder. Sometimes, after the body had been buried long enough for the flesh to decompose, people would dig it back up. They'd carefully remove the skull, then replaster it. They'd rebuild the face in clay, painting the features, recreating the person's appearance in a kind of prehistoric death mask. Then they'd keep these plastered skulls in the house, positioned in special niches or platforms, watching over the living like ancestral guardians. We've found dozens of these plastered skulls at Çatalhöyük. Some show evidence of being repainted multiple times over years or decades, suggesting they were maintained, cared for, possibly even handled during special rituals. The people weren't just honouring their dead, they were keeping them present, refusing to let them disappear into the past. This tells us something profound about the first city dwellers' worldview. They hadn't developed our modern concept of separation between life and death, sacred and secular, human and animal. Everything was interconnected. Your ancestors were beneath your feet. Wild animals decorated your walls. The power of bulls was trapped in plaster. The natural and supernatural occupied the same space. And then there's the most famous artifact ever found at Çatalhöyük, the seated woman. She's a small figurine, maybe 6 inches tall, carved from clay and fired in a kiln. She sits on what appears to be a throne or chair, her arms resting on the heads of 2 large felines, probably leopards. Her body is massive, voluminous, representing either pregnancy or simply abundant flesh. Her face is tiny by comparison, almost featureless, and she radiates power. When archaeologists first found her in the 1960s, they immediately declared her a mother goddess, evidence of matriarchal religion, proof that the first cities worshipped female deities associated with fertility and nature. For decades, she became an icon of feminist archaeology, suggesting that before patriarchal civilizations took over, humans lived in goddess-worshipping egalitarian societies. But here's where modern archaeology gets complicated, because we've found hundreds of other figurines at Çatalhöyük. Male figures, female figures, animal figures, figures that are ambiguous or deliberately gender-neutral. The seated woman isn't unique. She's just the most impressive example of what appears to be a widespread practice of creating anthropomorphic representations. Some archaeologists now think these figurines weren't gods or goddesses at all. They might have been teaching tools, used to explain concepts to children, or they might have been magical objects, believed to embody certain powers or qualities, or they might have been toys. The truth is, we don't know. We're looking at objects created 9,000 years ago by people whose worldview was radically different from ours, and we're trying to interpret them through the lens of modern religion. What we can say is that the people of Çatalhöyük had sophisticated symbolic thinking. They created representations of humans and animals. They understood abstraction and metaphor. They engaged in practices that involved ritual, belief, and communal meaning-making. Whether they worshipped goddesses or practiced shamanism, or had religious concepts we can't even imagine, they were clearly grappling with the same fundamental questions that drive human spirituality. Where do we come from? What happens when we die? What forces control our lives? The evidence of communal feasting suggests they sometimes came together to address these questions collectively. We've found special buildings, slightly larger than normal houses, with evidence of massive food preparation. Hundreds of people could have gathered in these spaces. Chemical analysis of the floors shows repeated episodes of feasting involving meat, grains, and possibly fermented beverages, something like beer or ale, though we can't be certain. Picture one of these gatherings. Maybe it's after the harvest, when food is abundant and the community can afford to consume lavishly. People climb down through the roof holes of their houses and make their way to the designated feasting building. Inside, fires are burning. Massive cooking pots are boiling grain-based porridge mixed with wild herbs. Meat is roasting, filling the space with smoke and smell. Someone, maybe a person with special knowledge about the spirit world, begins to speak or chant. The gathered crowd falls silent. What happened next is speculation, but it's informed speculation. Many archaeologists think Çatalhöyük had individuals who served as intermediaries with the spiritual realm, not priests in the formal sense because there don't seem to be religious hierarchies, but shamanic practitioners who could induce altered states of consciousness through fasting, rhythmic music, or possibly psychoactive substances. We know that several plants with consciousness-altering properties grew wild in the region around Çatalhöyük. Cannabis, opium poppies, certain species of mushrooms. Whether the inhabitants used them is uncertain, but they had the knowledge and the opportunity, and the art they created, those swirling geometric patterns and visionary animal images, has qualities that some researchers compare to imagery produced during trance states. This is where the psychology gets really interesting, because what these first city dwellers were doing was revolutionary at a cognitive level. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived as part of nature. We moved with the seasons, we ate what we could hunt or gather, we sheltered in caves or temporary camps. We were embedded in the natural world, subject to its rhythms and dangers. Then in places like Çatalhöyük, everything flipped. Suddenly humans were controlling nature. We were growing our own food. We were choosing which animals to breed. We were building permanent structures that defied the weather. We were creating our own rhythms, our own patterns, our own order. But that transition was psychologically terrifying. By controlling nature, we'd separated ourselves from it. We created a new category, civilization, a human-made world distinct from the wild world outside the settlement. And that separation came with profound anxiety. That's why the walls were covered with wild animals. That's why bullhorns dominated the living spaces. That's why vultures carried away the dead in painted scenes. The people of Çatalhöyük were trying to bridge the gap they'd created. They were bringing nature into their homes, not just as decoration, but as a way of maintaining connection with the wild world they'd left behind. They were trying to control nature and honour it simultaneously, to dominate animals while respecting their power, to live in permanent houses while remembering their ancestors who'd lived under open skies. This tension between civilization and wildness, between human order and natural chaos, would define all of human history from that point forward. The people of Çatalhöyük were the first to feel it, the first to try to resolve it through art and ritual and belief. They didn't fully succeed. Nobody has. We're still grappling with the same fundamental contradiction. We want safety and order, but we're drawn to wildness and freedom. We want to transcend nature, but we can't escape our origins as animals who once lived in fear of leopards and depended on the cycle of seasons. The difference is, the people of Çatalhöyük were honest about this tension. They made it visible on their walls. They embedded it in their floors. They lived with it every single day, sleeping above their ancestors and beneath images of the wild. But this new way of living, this first experiment in urban civilization, came with costs that nobody could have anticipated. Costs that would only become apparent after people had been living behind walls for generations. But living in the world's first city came with a price written in bone, etched in teeth, carved into skulls that archaeologists would find millennia later. Because here's what nobody tells you about civilization. It made us sicker, more violent, more stressed. And for the first few thousand years, it probably shortened our lives. The evidence is right there in the skeletons. Walk through the storage rooms of any museum that holds remains from Çatalhöyük, and you'll see it. Bones that tell stories of suffering that hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. Diseases that didn't exist before people decided to live wall to wall with thousands of their neighbours. Start with the most obvious thing: teeth. Hunter-gatherer skeletons from before the agricultural revolution show remarkably healthy teeth. Strong, intact, minimal decay. Makes sense. They ate a varied diet of meat, wild plants, nuts, and occasional wild fruits. Tough foods that clean their teeth as they chewed. No sugar to speak of. Plenty of nutrients to keep their enamel strong. Now look at the teeth from Çatalhöyük. It's a different story entirely. Massive decay, abscesses, teeth worn down to nubs from grinding grain. Some individuals in their 20s and 30s had lost most of their molars, not from violence or accidents, but from simple rot, the kind of dental disease that comes from eating grain-heavy diets 3 times a day, every day, for your entire life. The wheat and barley that made urban life possible were also destroying people's teeth. Grain particles would get stuck between teeth and along the gum line, creating perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. The starches would break down into sugars, feeding those bacteria, creating acids that dissolved tooth enamel. And unlike hunter-gatherers who ate and moved on, these people were eating grain at every meal, giving their teeth no break from the assault. Dental abscesses weren't just painful, they could kill you. Infections could spread to the jaw, the throat, eventually the bloodstream. In a world without antibiotics, a rotten tooth could be a death sentence, and these people had mouths full of them. But the teeth were just the beginning. Look closer at the bones and you see something that sends a chill through modern researchers, evidence of diseases that had never existed before, or at least never spread widely enough to leave their mark in the archaeological record. Tuberculosis. The telltale lesions show up on ribs and vertebrae from Çatalhöyük. This was one of humanity's first experiences with what we now call a crowd disease. TB needs dense populations to survive. It spreads through the air when infected people cough. It requires sustained close contact to pass from person to person. In the scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, TB couldn't gain a foothold. An infected individual would die or recover before spreading it widely. The disease would burn itself out. But pack 8,000 people into houses that share walls, where multiple families sleep in the same rooms, where the air is thick with smoke from cooking fires and no one ever gets far from their neighbours, and suddenly TB has paradise. It could jump from person to person, family to family, house to house. It could become endemic, always present in the population, waiting for someone with a weakened immune system to flourish in. The people of Çatalhöyük had no concept of germs, no understanding of infectious disease. They just knew that sometimes people developed the wasting sickness, the terrible cough that wouldn't stop, the fever that came and went, the slow decline that could take months or years, and there was nothing they could do but watch it happen. Other diseases came too. Parasites that hunter-gatherers rarely encountered suddenly became common. Intestinal worms that spread through contaminated food and water. In a settlement where thousands of people were living in close quarters, where sanitation meant tossing waste outside or burying it in pits, where water sources could become contaminated, parasites found ideal conditions to spread. The skeletal evidence shows chronic anemia in many individuals, likely caused by hookworms and other parasites that feed on blood in the intestines. These people weren't just hungry for nutrients. They were literally having their blood drained by invisible parasites they couldn't even see. And then there's the violence. This part is controversial among archaeologists. Some researchers emphasize that Çatalhöyük shows relatively little evidence of warfare or organized violence compared to later cities. No massive defensive walls, no piles of bodies showing signs of battle injuries, no warrior burials with weapons. But look at individual skeletons and the story gets darker. Multiple skulls show healed fractures, not accidents, not falls. Blunt force trauma consistent with being hit on the head with clubs or heavy objects. The injuries healed, meaning these people survived, but someone had struck them hard enough to crack their skulls. One skull shows evidence of being hit multiple times over the course of a life. Healed fracture on the left side from years earlier. Another on the right from more recently. This person was in fights, repeatedly, and survived. But how many others didn't? Some archaeologists interpret this as evidence of interpersonal violence, fights between neighbours, domestic abuse, arguments that escalated to physical assault. When you're living literally on top of each other, pressed wall to wall with minimal privacy, tensions rise. Disputes over resources, over social status, over perceived slights or violations of social norms. Sometimes those tensions explode into violence. Others suggest the injuries might be accidental. People falling from roofs, construction accidents, the hazards of daily life in a cramped settlement. But the pattern of injuries, concentrated on skulls, often from behind or from the side, suggests something more deliberate. Either way, it tells us something important. Life in the first city wasn't peaceful. Whatever benefits urban living provided, safety and tranquility weren't among them. The bones tell other stories of hardship too. Repetitive stress injuries that hunter-gatherers rarely showed. Deformities of the spine from carrying heavy loads. Arthritis in joints worn down from doing the same motions thousands of times. These are the marks of specialized labor, of people spending their entire lives doing one thing over and over. One woman's skeleton shows extreme wear on her knees and lower back, along with distinctive changes to her arm bones, probably from spending decades grinding grain, kneeling at a grinding stone for hours every day, using the same pushing and pulling motion to crush wheat and barley into flour. Her body had literally reshaped itself around this single repetitive task. Compare this to hunter-gatherer skeletons. They show wear patterns consistent with varied activities: running, climbing, throwing spears, digging, carrying. Their bodies reflect lives of diverse movement and activity. The Çatalhöyük skeletons show lives of monotony, the same tasks, day after day, year after year, until their bodies broke down from the repetition, and they were dying younger. This might be the most damning evidence of all. Hunter-gatherer populations that we can study from the archaeological record show that individuals who survived childhood had a decent chance of living into their 50s or 60s, some even longer. But at Çatalhöyük, average life expectancy after childhood was probably in the mid-30s, maybe early 40s if you were lucky. The grain diet wasn't providing enough nutrients, the diseases were taking a toll, the physical stress of daily life was wearing bodies down faster. For all the benefits of settlement life, longevity wasn't one of them. So here's the question that haunts researchers. Why did they stay? If city life was making them sicker, causing more violence, wearing out their bodies and killing them younger, why didn't they just leave? Return to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had sustained humans successfully for hundreds of thousands of years? Some probably did. The archaeological record shows population fluctuations. Times when parts of Çatalhöyük were abandoned, possibly as families decided they'd had enough and left for other opportunities. But most stayed, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years, enduring the diseases, the violence, the grinding labour, the shortened lives. Was it choice or necessity? That's what keeps anthropologists arguing. Some think it was a trap. Once you commit to agriculture and settlement life, you can't easily go back. You've forgotten the skills of your hunter-gatherer ancestors. You've grown dependent on stored grain. Your population has grown beyond what the surrounding wild resources could support. You're stuck. Others argue it was choice, that despite the costs, people genuinely preferred settlement life, the security of stored food, the social connections of living in a community, the access to trade goods and specialized crafts, the ritual life centered on the shrines and burials beneath their floors. Maybe they accepted the diseases and shortened lifespans as a reasonable price for these benefits. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Some stayed by choice, some by necessity. Some didn't really distinguish between the two. This was just life, the only life they'd ever known. Their parents had lived this way, their grandparents. It's what people did. You lived in the settlement, you grew grain, you worked until your body gave out, and when you died, your family buried you beneath the floor so you could watch over the next generations. But here's what really matters. These people, suffering through diseases they didn't understand, enduring violence they couldn't escape, grinding grain until their bodies broke, they were setting patterns that would echo through all of human history. The crowd diseases that emerged in Çatalhöyük would follow humanity forever. Tuberculosis is still with us, still killing people. So are the parasites, the nutritional deficiencies, the dental decay of grain-heavy diets. The social tensions of living in dense populations, the violence that emerges when people are pressed together with limited resources and no escape. That's still with us too. Urban crime, domestic abuse, the psychological stress of city living. All of it traces back to the first experiments in settlement life, even the repetitive stress injuries, the bodies reshaped by monotonous labour. Walk into any modern warehouse or factory and you'll see the same thing. People developing the same injuries their ancient predecessors suffered. Backs destroyed by lifting, joints worn out by repetitive motions. We've just gotten better at documenting it and slightly better at treating it. The people of Çatalhöyük were the first to pay the price of civilization, but they wouldn't be the last. Every city that came after would face the same challenges: disease, violence, social stress, shortened lives for many in exchange for benefits for some. And yet they stayed, just like we stay. Living in cities despite the crowds, the crime, the pollution, the stress. Because cities offer something we can't get elsewhere: connection, opportunity, culture, the chance to be part of something larger than ourselves. The first urbanites figured that out 9,000 years ago. They looked at the costs written in their aching backs and rotting teeth and tubercular lungs and decided it was worth it. Or at least decided they couldn't imagine any other way to live. We're still making that same calculation, still paying that same price, still living with the consequences of a choice made millennia ago by people who just wanted somewhere safe to store their grain and bury their dead. The walls they built didn't just contain a settlement, they contained a trap, a beautiful, terrible trap that humanity would never escape. Here's where the story of the first city gets really weird. You've got 10,000 people living wall to wall, literally in one place. For perspective, that's roughly the size of a small college campus or a large high school. Every person you'd pass on a daily basis, you'd probably recognize. Every voice filtering through those plaster walls somewhat familiar. But here's the mystery that keeps archaeologists up at night. Nobody was in charge. At least nobody left evidence that they were in charge. When you excavate later cities, even ones from just 1,000 years after Çatalhöyük, the power structures practically jump out at you. You find palaces, massive buildings with elaborate decorations where the ruler lived. You find temples, imposing structures that towered over everything else, broadcasting the power of the gods and the priests who spoke for them. You find royal tombs, burials so lavish and filled with such wealth that they might as well have neon signs saying "important person buried here." You find administrative buildings with clay tablets recording taxes, tribute, labour obligations, the bureaucratic machinery of hierarchy and control. At Çatalhöyük, nothing. No palace, no temple, no administrative complex, no royal anything. The largest houses weren't dramatically bigger than the smallest. The richest burials weren't orders of magnitude more elaborate than the simplest. There's no throne room, no audience hall, no fortified compound for the elite. Just hundreds of nearly identical houses, all crammed together, all looking essentially the same from the outside. It's like finding a city the size of a small town where every building is a suburban ranch house. Possible, sure, but deeply strange when you're trying to figure out how it actually worked. So how did they do it? How did 10,000 people live together without someone obviously being in charge? The answer seems to be very carefully and in a way we'd barely recognise as governance at all. The archaeological evidence points to something radical. Çatalhöyük appears to have been organised around households rather than centralised authority. Each house was essentially an autonomous unit, a self-governing micro-community, multiple generations of the same family living, working, dying, and being buried under the floors of the same building. The house wasn't just where you lived, it was your identity, your security, your connection to your ancestors, your claim to resources and knowledge and social standing. And here's where it gets fascinating. These weren't temporary arrangements. Houses at Çatalhöyük were continuously occupied and rebuilt on the exact same spot for hundreds of years. When a house became too old or damaged, the inhabitants would carefully fill it in, level it off, and build a new house directly on top. Same footprint, same orientation, same basic layout, like they were recreating their ancestral home over and over, maintaining continuity across generations. Excavators have found buildings with 5, 6, 7 layers of reconstruction spanning centuries. The same family, or their descendants, living in essentially the same house for periods that would dwarf the entire history of the United States. Your great-great-great-great-grandmother had slept in the same spot you sleep in, had ground grain at the same hearth, had buried her dead in the same corner under the same platform. The house was eternal, or as close to eternal as humans could make anything. This created an interesting social dynamic. Status and authority weren't about individual achievement, so much as about ancestry and continuity. The oldest houses, the ones with the deepest histories, carried the most weight. Archaeologists call these history houses, and they're one of the few clear signs of social differentiation in the settlement. History houses are slightly larger than average, though not dramatically so. They're more elaborately decorated with more wall paintings, more plastered bull skulls, more evidence of ritual activity. Most tellingly, they show unbroken sequences of occupation spanning the entire history of the settlement. These were the founding houses, the original families, the lineages that could trace their presence back to the very beginning. And they seem to have held special positions in the community. Not rulers exactly. There's no evidence they could command others or extract tribute. But they were knowledge keepers, the houses where important rituals were performed, where communal decisions might have been made, where the stories and traditions that held the community together were maintained and passed down. Think of them less like kings and more like the oldest, most respected families in a small town. The ones everyone knows, the ones who've been there forever, whose opinions carry weight not because they have power, but because they have history. The difference is that at Çatalhöyük this wasn't informal social convention, it was literally built into the architecture. The history houses were physical embodiments of continuity and tradition. Knowledge transfer happened through these houses in ways that would have seemed natural to the inhabitants, but look alien to us. You didn't go to school. You learned by living in your house, watching your parents and grandparents, participating in the daily rhythms of work and ritual that had been performed in that exact space for centuries. The walls themselves were teaching tools, covered in paintings and plaster reliefs that encoded important information about hunts, dangers, spiritual beliefs. And when your grandparents died, they weren't taken away to some distant cemetery. They were buried right there, under the platform where you slept. You literally slept on top of your ancestors every night. Try to imagine the psychological impact of that, the sense of connection, of obligation, of continuity. Your ancestors weren't abstract figures from the distant past. They were 3 feet below you, their bones mixing with the clay and ash that form the foundation of your world. This created natural checks on disruptive behavior. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted, because your actions affected not just you but your entire lineage. Cause problems, and you're not just risking your own status. You're risking the standing of your house, the reputation of your ancestors, the prospects of your descendants. Everything was interconnected across time in a way that modern individualistic societies can barely conceive. But what about gender? Surely in a society this old, this close to our hunter-gatherer origins, we'd expect to find rigid patriarchal structures, men dominating, women subordinate. Right? Wrong. Or at least not in any straightforward way. The burial evidence from Çatalhöyük is startling. Men and women are buried with essentially the same treatment, same body positions, same types of grave goods, same locations under the floors. There's no obvious hierarchy based on sex. Rich burials and poor burials both include males and females in roughly equal proportions. Some of the most elaborate burials with the highest quality goods belong to women. Some of the simplest belong to men. Analysis of skeletal remains tells an even more interesting story. Both men and women show evidence of hard physical labour, joint stress, muscle attachment points, patterns of wear that suggest everybody was working hard at a variety of tasks. But the patterns aren't identical between sexes, suggesting some division of labour, though less rigid than we might expect. Women's skeletons show distinctive wear patterns on their arms and backs consistent with grinding grain for hours every day. A brutal, repetitive task that modern people who've tried to replicate say is absolutely exhausting. But men's skeletons don't show these patterns, suggesting this was primarily female labour. Men's skeletons show more upper body development and more healed fractures, particularly in the arms and ribs, consistent with hunting large animals, butchering heavy carcasses, doing the kind of dangerous physical work that involves tools and unpredictable outcomes. So yes, there was division of labour. But here's what's wild. The burial evidence suggests this division didn't translate into hierarchy. Women who spent their lives grinding grain were buried with as much respect and as many goods as men who hunted. The work was different, but the value assigned to it seems to have been roughly equivalent. There's even evidence that some individuals crossed these gender lines. Several burials show skeletal patterns that don't match their burial goods. A body with typically male skeletal markers buried with typically female goods, or vice versa. This could mean several things. Maybe these were individuals who performed work typically associated with the other gender. Maybe Çatalhöyük had social categories beyond our simple male-female binary. Or maybe gender just wasn't as rigidly enforced as we automatically assume it must have been. We don't know. But the evidence suggests flexibility, not rigid hierarchy. And that's important because it tells us something about how the society maintained cohesion without obvious leaders. Without a central authority to enforce rules, social control had to come from somewhere else. The evidence suggests it came from everywhere at once. The tight physical proximity, the shared walls, the rooftop pathways that meant everyone could see everyone else's business. You couldn't hide much in Çatalhöyük. Your neighbours heard your arguments, smelled your cooking, knew when you were home and when you weren't. This created what anthropologists call peer policing. Everyone watching everyone else, social pressure from all directions simultaneously. Step out of line, and you wouldn't face a judge or a police force. You'd face your neighbours, your extended family, the people you'd be living alongside for the rest of your life, and whose children would be living alongside your children. The archaeological evidence actually shows this in action. Several houses have doorways that were deliberately blocked with rubble, sealed shut while the rest of the house remained occupied. These weren't houses being abandoned or demolished. They were houses being partially closed off, access restricted. Archaeologists think this might be evidence of social sanctions, families who violated community norms having their access to shared spaces restricted, being partially isolated as punishment without being completely expelled. It's a clever solution, really. Harsh enough to matter, to genuinely punish bad behaviour, but not so extreme as to fragment the community or create permanent outcasts who might become dangerous. You're still part of the settlement, still physically connected to everyone else, but your social world has shrunk. You've been reminded that you need the community more than it needs you. Conflicts within houses were probably handled within the family structure, with elders mediating based on tradition and precedent. Conflicts between houses might have been brought to the history houses, where respected families with deep knowledge of custom could offer judgments that carried moral weight if not legal force. And if someone became truly intolerable? The evidence suggests they might have been expelled entirely. Several burials at Çatalhöyük show signs of violent death. Bodies with unhealed injuries, buried hastily without the usual ritual care. These might have been criminals or rule breakers who were killed or driven out and then later buried when their bodies were discovered. Or they might have been victims of inter-household violence that escalated beyond the community's ability to control. Violence was rare, but it existed. The society wasn't some peaceful utopia. It was 10,000 people crammed into close quarters with no escape valves, no way to just leave if you got angry or frustrated or couldn't stand your neighbours anymore. Occasionally things snapped, but the remarkable thing is how rarely they snapped. For over 1,000 years this system worked. Thousands of people across dozens of generations lived together without kings, without priests who wielded political power, without police, courts, or armies. They managed it through shared tradition, through the stabilizing weight of the past literally underfoot, through social structures that made everyone accountable to everyone else. It's perhaps the most successful experiment in non-hierarchical large-scale living in human history, and nobody even knows it existed. But Çatalhöyük wasn't alone. While those 10,000 people were living shoulder to shoulder in their honeycomb city without streets, something else was happening about 500 miles northwest. Something that would challenge everything archaeologists thought they knew about the first cities. Picture this: the Jordan Valley around 9000 BCE, a natural spring gushing out of the ground at a rate of about 1,000 gallons per minute, creating an oasis in what would otherwise be harsh, semi-arid landscape. And around that spring, a settlement that looked nothing like Çatalhöyük. This was Jericho, and it had walls. Not metaphorical walls, not boundaries made of custom and agreement, actual massive stone walls, 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, encircling the entire settlement. Walls that took thousands of hours of coordinated labour to build. Walls that announce to anyone approaching, this place is different. This place is defended. This place belongs to us. For decades, archaeologists debated which settlement deserved the title of First City, Çatalhöyük with its sprawling mass of interconnected houses, or Jericho with its clear defensive perimeter. The truth is, they were both pioneering different solutions to the same problem. How do you organize human society when thousands of people need to live together permanently? But Jericho came first, at least for the walls. When British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho in the 1950s, she found something that stopped the archaeological world in its tracks. Beneath layer after layer of later settlements, beneath Bronze Age ruins and Neolithic villages, she found those massive walls, and carbon dating put them at 11,000 years old, 1,000 years older than Çatalhöyük, nearly 3,000 years older than the pyramids. Think about what this means. 11,000 years ago, most of humanity was still living in small mobile bands, hunting, gathering, moving seasonally to follow resources. Agriculture was just beginning in a few scattered locations. Pottery hadn't been invented yet. Neither had writing. Metalworking was still 6,000 years in the future. And yet somehow, in this one spot in the Jordan Valley, people had organized themselves sufficiently to quarry massive stones, transport them to a construction site, and stack them into walls that would still be standing 11 millennia later. But here's where it gets really wild. The walls weren't even the most impressive part. Inside the settlement, right up against the wall, sat a tower. Not a watchtower, not a simple platform. A massive stone tower, 28 feet tall and 28 feet in diameter at the base, with an internal staircase, 22 steps carved into the stone spiralling up through the centre of the structure to a flat platform at the top. When archaeologists first found it, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. This wasn't just functional architecture. This was monumental. This was a statement. This was people 11,000 years ago deciding to invest thousands of hours of labour into building something that reached toward the sky. The question that kept everyone up at night was simple. Why? Why would people who had just barely transitioned from hunting and gathering invest so much energy in building walls and towers? What were they defending against? What were they watching for? Or was defense even the point? The biblical connection didn't help. Everyone knew the story. Joshua and the Israelites marching around the walls of Jericho, blowing their trumpets, watching the walls come tumbling down. For centuries, this narrative coloured everything. Early archaeologists came to Jericho looking for evidence of the biblical account, trying to match archaeological layers to Bronze Age invasions. But the walls Kenyon found were far older than any biblical timeline. They dated to a period before recorded history, before writing, before the Israelites, before the Egyptians had even begun building their first monuments. These walls belong to a different story entirely, a story we're still trying to understand. The first theory was obvious. Defense. Walls keep enemies out. Towers let you see them coming. Simple, logical, fitting with how we understand fortifications today. But there were problems with this theory. The Jordan Valley 11,000 years ago wasn't exactly crowded. Population density was still incredibly low. Warfare, at least as we understand it, probably hadn't developed yet. There's no evidence of weapons designed specifically for human combat, no evidence of violent destruction at this early level. So what were they defending against? Some archaeologists proposed floods. The settlement sat near a powerful spring in a valley that could channel flash floods during the rainy season. Maybe the walls weren't meant to keep people out, but to keep water out, channeling floodwaters around the settlement, protecting the houses and the all-important spring. But other archaeologists pointed out that If you're just trying to manage water, you don't need walls 12 feet high. You need berms, ditches, channels. Flood control doesn't require towers with internal staircases. The latest theory is perhaps the most intriguing. The walls weren't functional at all. They were symbolic, a boundary between the civilized world inside and the wild world outside, a marker of identity, a way of saying we're not like those nomadic hunter-gatherers wandering through the valley. We are settled, we are permanent, we're different. And the tower? Some researchers think it was astronomical. Analysis of its orientation shows it aligned with the setting sun on the summer solstice, and on that day each year the shadow of a nearby mountain would have fallen directly onto the tower just as the sun set. Maybe it was a calendar, a way of marking the passage of seasons, or maybe it was ritual, a connection between the human-built tower and the natural mountain, between the community and the cosmos. We don't know. And there's something beautiful about that uncertainty, something that reminds us these were people with their own reasons, their own beliefs, their own logic that might have made perfect sense to them but remains mysterious to us 11,000 years later. What we do know is that life in Jericho was dramatically different from life in Çatalhöyük, where Çatalhöyük had no streets. Jericho had clear pathways between structures. Where Çatalhöyük had houses all at the same elevation, all pressed together, Jericho had distinct buildings with space between them. Where Çatalhöyük had no obvious public buildings, Jericho had that tower, that wall, structures that required community coordination to build and maintain. The houses were different too. Where Çatalhöyük's homes were entered through the roof, Jericho's houses had doors at ground level, opening onto those pathways. Where Çatalhöyük buried their dead under the floors, Jericho created dedicated burial areas, separating the living and the dead spatially. Even the economy seems to have been different. Çatalhöyük shows evidence of relatively egalitarian distribution of resources. Most houses were similar in size and contents, but Jericho shows hints of emerging hierarchy. Some structures were larger, better built, contained more valuable goods. Some burials were more elaborate than others. It's almost like they were running different experiments. Çatalhöyük testing, where the humans could live in extreme density, with minimal formal organization. Jericho testing, where the walls and boundaries and clear hierarchies could help organize urban life. And here's what's remarkable. Both experiments worked. Both settlements thrived for thousands of years. Jericho was continuously occupied for over 4,000 years at this early period. Çatalhöyük lasted about 1,400 years. Both eventually collapsed, but not because the basic model was flawed. Both proved that large-scale permanent settlement was possible. The population at early Jericho was smaller than Çatalhöyük, probably around 2,000 to 3,000 people at its peak. But it was still massive by the standards of the time, still required solving all the same basic problems: water management, waste disposal, food storage, conflict resolution. They just solved them differently. Jericho's economy was based heavily on trade. The settlement sat at a crossroads, a natural stopping point for anyone moving through the Jordan Valley. The spring provided reliable water. The walls provided security. And gradually Jericho became a trading hub, a place where nomadic groups could exchange goods, where obsidian from Anatolia met shells from the Red Sea, where ideas and technologies from across the Fertile Crescent mixed and merged. Archaeological evidence shows Jericho's residents were trading with communities hundreds of miles away. They had access to materials that didn't exist locally, technologies that had been developed elsewhere. They weren't isolated pioneers. They were connected, part of a broader network of early agricultural communities stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. And they were innovating. The tower itself represents a level of architectural sophistication that wouldn't be matched for millennia. The stonework shows planning, mathematics, engineering knowledge. Someone had to calculate load-bearing capacities, design the internal staircase, coordinate teams of workers. This wasn't just piling stones. This was construction in the modern sense. But perhaps the most interesting difference between Jericho and Çatalhöyük wasn't physical. It was psychological. The very existence of those walls suggests a different relationship with the outside world. Çatalhöyük had no walls, no defences, nothing separating inside from outside except the mass of the buildings themselves. This suggests either incredible security or incredible naivety. Either they had nothing to fear, or they hadn't yet learned to fear. Jericho's walls suggest the opposite, a consciousness of boundaries, of us versus them, of the need to mark territory and defend it. Whether those walls were built to keep out enemies, floods, or wild animals, they represent a mental shift, a recognition that the world outside contains threats that must be managed. This is one of the fundamental transformations that comes with settled life. Hunter-gatherers rarely build fortifications. They don't need to. If danger approaches, you move. But once you've invested years of labour into fields, houses and infrastructure, you can't just move. You have to defend. You have to draw lines. You have to say this is ours, and we will protect it. Jericho's walls might be the first physical manifestation of that transformation, the first time humans decided that a place was valuable enough to defend rather than abandon. And that decision, that shift from mobility to rootedness, from flexibility to investment, changed everything. It made cities possible. It made kingdoms possible. It made civilization possible. But it also made war possible, made territorial conflict inevitable, made the distinction between insider and outsider, citizen and stranger, us and them. Two experiments, two paths. Çatalhöyük without walls, trying to organize density through social bonds alone. Jericho with walls, using physical boundaries to define community. Both succeeded for thousands of years. Both eventually failed. Both left behind lessons we're still trying to decipher about how humans can live together in large numbers without destroying each other or themselves. But the question remained, why did either of them work at all? How did thousands of people, who had spent hundreds of thousands of years living in bands of 20 or 30, suddenly figure out how to cooperate at scales 100 times larger? The answer lies in what archaeologists found when they looked more carefully at how these early cities organized themselves socially. And what they found was surprising. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not civilizations, not even the first cities that changed what it meant to be human. Around 5,700 BCE, after nearly 2,000 years of continuous habitation, something began to go wrong at Çatalhöyük. The archaeological evidence tells a story of slow decline. Not catastrophic collapse, not sudden disaster, but a gradual unravelling that took generations to complete. The signs are subtle, but unmistakable. In the upper levels of the mound, the houses become smaller, less carefully constructed. The elaborate wall paintings that had covered interior rooms for millennia become simpler, then rare, then absent entirely. The burials show increasing signs of malnutrition and disease. Most tellingly, entire sections of the settlement stand empty. Houses left to crumble while their inhabitants moved elsewhere or simply disappeared. Within a few centuries, the city that had thrived for 2,000 years was abandoned completely. Its mud brick houses melted back into the earth, its streets filled with wind-blown dust. The hearth fires that had burned continuously for 60 generations went cold and stayed cold. By 5,600 BCE, Çatalhöyük was a ghost town, a 20-metre-tall mound of archaeological remains that would lie undisturbed for the next 7,000 years. So what happened? Why did humanity's first great urban experiment come to an end? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. The people who abandoned Çatalhöyük left no written records explaining their decision. They simply packed up whatever they could carry and walked away. But the physical evidence they left behind tells us several possible stories, and the truth probably involves all of them working together. First, there's environmental degradation. 2,000 years of intensive human habitation takes a toll on the landscape. The forest that had once surrounded Çatalhöyük had been cut down for timber and fuel. Archaeological analysis of wood remains shows that early inhabitants had access to mature oak and pine trees, but by the final centuries they were burning scrub brush and dried dung. The good timber was gone. The soil was exhausted too. Ancient crop remains from late-period Çatalhöyük show smaller seeds, evidence that agricultural yields were declining. Without modern fertilizers or crop rotation practices, the fields that had fed the city for millennia were wearing out. Each generation got slightly less food from the same amount of work. Eventually, the mathematics stopped making sense. Why stay in a city where you have to work harder each year for less reward? The water situation was probably deteriorating as well. Çatalhöyük had been built near the Çarşamba River and several seasonal streams, but deforestation changes hydrology. Without tree roots to hold soil in place and regulate water flow, the landscape becomes prone to flooding during wet seasons and drought during dry periods. The reliable water sources that had sustained the city for generations may have become unreliable, forcing inhabitants to travel further and further to meet basic needs. Then there's resource depletion of a different kind. Çatalhöyük's obsidian trade had made it wealthy for centuries, but volcanic glass only forms in specific geological settings. The nearest sources were already being mined intensively by multiple settlements. As the easily accessible obsidian was extracted, the cost of obtaining this crucial resource would have increased. Trade networks that had once made Çatalhöyük prosperous may have begun favouring other settlements with better access to remaining deposits. But environmental and economic explanations only tell part of the story. There's also evidence of social breakdown in the final centuries. The egalitarian structure that had held Çatalhöyük together for so long shows signs of strain. Some late-period burials contain significantly more grave goods than others, suggesting wealth inequality was increasing. The communal unity that had made living in such close quarters tolerable was fracturing. Disease may have played a role too. Dense urban living creates perfect conditions for infectious disease transmission. For 2 millennia, Çatalhöyük's inhabitants had maintained the delicate balance between population density and public health. But maybe that balance was becoming unsustainable. We know from skeletal evidence that disease burden increased in the later periods. Perhaps epidemics were becoming more frequent or more severe, convincing people that the urban experiment was no longer worth the risk. And there's one more possibility, perhaps the simplest and most human of all, better opportunities elsewhere. By 5700 BCE, the revolutionary idea of living in permanent settlements had spread far beyond Çatalhöyük. Dozens, maybe hundreds of similar communities existed across Anatolia and the Near East. Some of them had fresher fields, fuller forests, better access to trade routes. Why stay in a worn-out city when you could move to a younger settlement with more resources and more room to grow? The abandonment probably happened in waves. A few families leave, then a few more. Each departure makes life slightly harder for those who remain because there are fewer people to share the labour of maintaining the communal infrastructure. Eventually you reach a tipping point where staying becomes impossible, and the remaining inhabitants disperse, some joining relatives in other settlements, others perhaps founding new communities altogether. But here's what's crucial. The end of Çatalhöyük wasn't the end of the urban experiment. It was the beginning of something much larger. Those departing families didn't abandon city life. They carried the knowledge and skills of urban living with them to new territories, new opportunities. The archaeological record from the millennia following Çatalhöyük's decline shows an explosion of settlement founding across the Near East. It's like watching dandelion seeds catch the wind, spreading the urban concept across thousands of miles. By 5000 BCE, permanent settlements dot the landscape from modern Turkey to Iran. Some are small farming villages, but others are growing into towns and proto-cities. They're all building on lessons learned at Çatalhöyük and similar early settlements. How to organize large groups of unrelated families, how to coordinate labor for communal projects, how to resolve disputes without everyone killing each other, how to worship, trade, and live together in permanent proximity. Then, around 4000 BCE, something extraordinary happens in southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The urban concept explodes into full civilization. Cities like Uruk grow to populations of 40,000 or more, dwarfing anything that came before. These aren't just big villages anymore. These are complex societies with social hierarchies, specialized labor, monumental architecture, and most revolutionary of all, writing. The Mesopotamians didn't invent urbanism from nothing. They inherited it from centuries of experimentation by people who could trace their cultural ancestry back through multiple generations to places like Çatalhöyük. Every innovation those first city dwellers had pioneered, communal grain storage, standardized construction techniques, trade networks, religious centers, became building blocks for something larger and more complex. The same pattern repeats across the ancient world. The Indus Valley civilization emerges around 3300 BCE, with carefully planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, featuring sophisticated drainage systems and standardized brick sizes that would have made Çatalhöyük's builders proud. Egyptian civilization coalesces around 3100 BCE, creating cities along the Nile that combine urban density with agricultural surplus in ways that echo and amplify the Neolithic revolution that started millennia earlier. Chinese civilization develops urban centers by 2000 BCE. Mesoamerican cities rise in the centuries that follow. Each represents an independent trajectory, but all are building on the same fundamental breakthrough that happened at Çatalhöyük and a handful of other early settlements. The realization that humans could live together permanently in large numbers, and that doing so provided advantages that outweighed the considerable costs. And those innovations born in the first cities, they're still with us. Every time you live in a building with shared walls, you're experiencing an architectural solution pioneered at Çatalhöyük. Every time you participate in community decision-making, you're engaging with social technologies developed to manage life in those early settlements. The concept of property ownership, of inherited wealth, of specialized labor, these all have roots in the Neolithic revolution that created the first cities. Even our religious and spiritual practices carry echoes of those painted walls and buried ancestors. The idea of sacred spaces within secular communities, of communal worship, of using art and ritual to create shared meaning. All of this was being worked out in the crowded houses of Çatalhöyük, while most of humanity still lived in small nomadic bands. But perhaps the most profound legacy is something less tangible, something that happened inside human consciousness itself. For millions of years, humans had seen themselves as part of nature, subject to its rhythms and whims, adapting to environments but not fundamentally changing them. The creation of permanent settlements represented a dramatic shift in that relationship. For the first time, humans were actively reshaping their environment on a large scale. They were cutting down forests, diverting water, transforming wild grasses into domesticated crops. They were building structures meant to last generations, accumulating possessions, planning for futures that extended beyond individual lifetimes. They were becoming, for better and worse, architects of their own world rather than simply inhabitants of it. This shift in consciousness is so complete that we struggle to imagine any other way of being. We are the inheritors of that Neolithic revolution, living in a world where nearly everything around us has been shaped by human hands and minds. Our cities, our agriculture, our technologies, even the climate itself bears the mark of human intervention. We look at wilderness and see resources to be managed. We look at problems and imagine engineering solutions. This mindset has given us antibiotics and airplanes, art and architecture, everything that makes modern life possible. But it's also given us environmental destruction, resource depletion, and the existential challenges of climate change. The same drive to control and reshape our environment that built Çatalhöyük has now transformed the entire planet. And that brings us to perhaps the most relevant lesson those first cities offer. They weren't sustainable forever. Despite lasting nearly 2,000 years, despite the ingenuity and determination of their inhabitants, Çatalhöyük eventually exhausted its environment and had to be abandoned. The first city dwellers learned this truth the hard way. You can't grow indefinitely in a finite landscape without consequences. Today, we face similar challenges on a vastly larger scale. Our global urban civilization has achieved things that would seem like magic to the people of Çatalhöyük, but we're also running up against the same fundamental limits: resource depletion, environmental degradation, the difficulty of maintaining social cohesion as communities grow larger and more diverse, the health consequences of dense living. All of it echoes those final centuries at humanity's first city. But there's hope in the story too. When Çatalhöyük declined, its people didn't give up on urban living. They adapted, they moved, they founded new settlements with lessons learned from both successes and failures. The urban experiment didn't end, it evolved, spreading and diversifying until it covered the planet. Maybe that's the real legacy of the first cities, not that they lasted forever, but that they proved humans could live together in large numbers, could organize complex societies, could create meaning and beauty even in crowded, challenging conditions. And when one approach stopped working, we were creative enough to try something different. As we lie here thinking about those painted walls and buried ancestors, about the first humans who dared to build something permanent, we're connected to them across 10,000 years. Every city we live in, every community we build, every time we come together to solve collective problems, we're continuing the experiment they began. The walls of Çatalhöyük are dust now, but the idea they represented, that humans could reshape their world and live together in ways their ancestors never imagined, that idea has never been stronger. For better and worse, we're all children of the first city, still learning the lessons those ancient builders left behind. So here we are, at the end of a journey that started 10,000 years ago behind the oldest walls. But really it's not the end at all, is it? Every city you've ever walked through, every apartment building, every street corner where strangers pass without acknowledgement, every crowded subway car where people stand inches apart pretending the others don't exist, all of it traces back to those first experiments. Çatalhöyük, Jericho, the unnamed settlements we haven't even discovered yet, those first brave humans who decided to try something that had never been tried before, living together, not just families, not just clans, but hundreds, then thousands of people sharing space, sharing resources, sharing their lives with strangers. Think about what that took. These weren't people with instruction manuals. Nobody had written how to build a city for dummies. They were making it up as they went along, figuring out how to store grain without it rotting, how to keep disease from spreading when you're living wall to wall with your neighbours, how to resolve disputes without everyone killing each other, how to maintain your identity when you're surrounded by hundreds of other people doing the same thing. They were improvising solutions to problems that had never existed before. And somehow, despite all the violence, despite the diseases, despite the inequality that was already creeping in, despite the fact that many of these first cities eventually collapsed and were abandoned, somehow the experiment worked well enough that we kept trying. Every generation building on what the previous one learned, every new settlement taking the lessons from the old ones and adding their own innovations. The walls got taller, the houses got more sophisticated, the art became more elaborate, the social structures grew more complex. And slowly, over thousands of years, we transformed from those small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across open landscapes into urban creatures adapted to life behind walls. We're still those same humans, carrying the same DNA, the same basic brain structure. But we've built a completely different world around ourselves, a world our ancestors could never have imagined, cities of millions, buildings that touch the sky, networks connecting every human on the planet, and it all started with someone in a place like Çatalhöyük making a choice, deciding to stay, to plant seeds, to build walls, to invite others in, to try this crazy experiment of permanent settlement. Were they making history? Did they know they were changing everything? Probably not. They were probably just trying to survive, trying to make life a little easier for their children, trying to create some stability in an uncertain world. But that's how the biggest changes always happen, isn't it? Not through grand plans, but through small decisions that accumulate generation after generation, until suddenly everything is different. The walls of Çatalhöyük have been silent for 7,000 years now. The last fires went cold. The last voice spoke, the last child played in those narrow streets. But the echo of what happened there still reverberates through every city on earth. Every time we choose cooperation over violence, every time we share space with strangers, every time we create something beautiful, not because we have to, but because we can, we're channeling those first city dwellers. We're continuing their experiment. And here's the beautiful thing. We're still learning about them. Right now, archaeologists are working at Çatalhöyük, at Jericho, at dozens of other ancient sites, carefully brushing away dirt that's been undisturbed for millennia. They're finding new buildings, new artifacts, new evidence of how these people lived. Technologies like ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis are revealing secrets that previous generations of researchers never could have discovered. Every few years, something turns up that changes our understanding completely. A new burial practice, a previously unknown trade network, evidence of foods we didn't know they ate. These ancient places aren't finished telling their stories, not even close. We're all descendants of that first urban gamble, all products of those experiments behind the oldest walls. The anxiety you feel in crowds, the comfort you take in private space, the way you navigate social hierarchies, the foods you crave, even the diseases you're susceptible to, all of it shaped by thousands of years of urban living that started in places like Çatalhöyük. We carry those first cities with us wherever we go. Thank you for joining me on this journey into deep human history, for spending this time exploring what life was really like behind the oldest walls. If you enjoyed this exploration, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd hit that like button. It helps more people discover these stories. And if you have a moment, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Are you in a modern city continuing the urban experiment, or somewhere quieter, closer to how our ancestors lived before the walls went up? I'd love to know. If you want to continue exploring human history with me, hit subscribe. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more mysteries to uncover. And if you'd like to support the channel and help create more content like this, there's a YouTube membership option with some extra perks. But no pressure. Just being here, listening, thinking about these ancient people and their lives, that's enough. Sleep well, And remember, those first walls may be ruins now, but what they started is still very much alive.